John Carter's career was built on trust, but one decision shattered it all. When a confident black man walked into his office, John's refusal to show him a property changed everything. What happened next would haunt them both forever. But let's start from the beginning. John Carter had built a reputation in a prosperous neighborhood where trust and professionalism were valued above all else. For over a decade, he'd cultivated relationships with clients who knew him as reliable and committed to finding them the perfect home. His success was a product of hard work and dedication, qualities that earned him respect in the community. But when Derek Williams, a black man in his mid-30s, entered his office that fateful morning, something shifted in John. There was no logical explanation for it, yet he couldn't shake the unease that crept up inside him. Derek, confident yet calm, was looking for a house, specifically in the very neighborhood John had worked in for years, a place where he could build a future for his family. John had seen countless clients over the years, but this encounter was different. Derek's presence triggered a tightness in John's chest. His usual smoothness faltered. Derek was polite, asking about a high-end property listed for sale just a few blocks away. The house had been a point of pride for John. Its price tag, its amenities, and its ideal location in a prestigious neighborhood. And yet, in that moment, John hesitated. He felt his throat tighten as he searched for a way out. His voice sounded distant when he finally spoke. "That house is under contract, Mr. Williams," he said, keeping his gaze focused on the papers in front of him. "I'm afraid it's no longer available." Derek's face shifted ever so slightly, a brief moment of disappointment. He nodded, sensing that something was off, but he didn't press further. He simply stood up, gave a polite handshake, and left the office. As Derek exited, John felt an uncomfortable wave of relief wash over him. It was over. But as the door closed behind Derek, a deep knot of guilt settled in John's stomach. He'd done what was expected of him, yet the weight of the decision hung heavy, unanswered. A week had passed since their first meeting, but Derek Williams returned with a quiet resolve that John hadn't anticipated. His demeanor was different, more persistent, more confident. The unease that John had felt before, the instinctive hesitation, was now replaced by something sharper, more palpable. It was as if the tension between them had thickened in the days since their last encounter, settling into something undeniable. Derek stepped into the office with a directness that couldn't be ignored. He wasn't here to be turned away again. This time, he was insistent. "I want to see the house," he said, his voice calm but firm. John had hoped Derek might change his mind or accept his previous refusal, but as the man stood there so determined, John knew he couldn't avoid this moment. The air in the room felt thick with expectation, and John found himself caught in the weight of the decision he had made just days before. He opened his mouth, but the words came out colder than he intended. "Mr. Williams, I'm sorry, but I don't think that property is suitable for you." The words hung in the air, each syllable heavier than the last. Derek's eyes widened in disbelief, and for a brief moment, John saw something flicker, something painful. Derek wasn't surprised, but the sting of rejection, that subtle form of racism, hit him with the force of a slap. He had faced these kinds of moments before, but never quite like this. Never from someone who was supposed to be a professional, someone who should have been above these biases. "Why are you refusing me, John?" Derek asked, his voice trembling with quiet frustration. John could feel the pressure mounting, his chest tightening. His initial excuse had been a lie, a flimsy pretext that he now had no way of backing up. Derek's gaze was unwavering, a mixture of confusion and anger. And yet, despite the emotional weight of it all, John couldn't bring himself to face what was happening. Derek's eyes searched him, desperate for an explanation, but John refused to meet the reality of his own actions. Instead, he held his ground, his expression hardening as he watched Derek walk out. The door clicked shut behind him, and John was left in silence, the weight of his own refusal settling into something darker, humiliation perhaps, but more than that, sorrow. That evening, John tossed and turned in bed, his mind replaying the confrontation over and over. Derek's words echoed in his ears, the tremble in his voice, a sound that spoke more than any of the words themselves. Hurt. Disbelief. But what stuck with John the most was the silence that followed. Derek hadn't argued. He hadn't tried to fight back. He had simply left, and in that quiet exit, John realized the depth of his own actions. He had rejected a man, a potential client, without cause. No professional reason, no valid excuse, just an instinctive, deeply ingrained prejudice that John could no longer ignore. Every time he closed his eyes, the weight of that rejection grew heavier. The guilt gnawed at him like a slow burn, creeping deeper into his conscience. He had allowed his own bias to cloud his judgment, to dictate the way he treated someone simply because of their race. The realization cut deeper than he expected. John tossed the covers aside and got out of bed, his thoughts spinning. How could he have let it go this far? His mind raced, desperately trying to justify his actions, to find a reason, any reason, that could explain what he had done. But every excuse he came up with only made the guilt worse. He couldn't escape the truth. He had wronged Derek, and no amount of rationalizing could change that. The next morning, John woke up with a sense of dread that clung to him like a heavy fog. He couldn't go on like this. He couldn't let that moment define who he was. The shame was unbearable. He grabbed his phone and found Derek's contact information, his fingers trembling as he dialed the number. The line rang twice before Derek picked up. John swallowed hard, the words sticking in his throat. "Mr. Williams," he began, his voice shaking with the weight of his confession. I made a mistake. I need to apologize. I treated you unfairly." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. John could hear the faint rustle of movement, but nothing else. Finally, Derek spoke, his voice cautious, almost guarded. "I appreciate you reaching out, John. But why?" John explained how he had allowed his biases to affect his professional judgment. He told Derek that he had wrongly assumed that someone like him wouldn't belong in that neighborhood. As John spoke, his guilt poured out, and Derek listened, quietly processing. After a long pause, Derek spoke with quiet dignity. "I knew something was wrong, but I didn't expect you to admit it. I appreciate that, John." John arranged a new meeting with Derek. This time, John took him to the property. No excuses, no hesitation. And as Derek stepped into the house, John felt a surge of relief. The air was different. The weight had lifted. Derek wasn't just a client. He was a person. And John's redemption was complete when Derek decided to make an offer on the house. The deal went through without any further obstacles. As the transaction was finalized, John knew he had done something important, not just for his career, but for his own understanding of who he was. Derek had opened a door not just to a new home, but to a new perspective. John smiled as they shook hands, finally at peace with his choice. The satisfaction was overwhelming, not only because the deal was done, but because the world had just shifted a little for the better.